In 2024, Riot Games announced that their popular online card game, Legends of Runeterra, would not be receiving any new balance updates, cards, or any content for their flagship mode PvP. While the exact terminology gets very contentious, by not actively getting new sets, Runeterra's PvP is effectively dead, ending a 4-year-long struggle to figure out how to monetize its relatively large audience. This matters so much because Legends of Runeterra was a shining beacon of free-to-play game design. It had an incredibly generous system of giving players free cards, and a favorable ratio of dusted to crafted cards, one of the highest in its genre. As a casual player myself, there were multiple times in which I was able to complete the card pool. But despite the estimated 500,000 to 1 million active players, it's no surprise that Runeterra struggled to make enough money for Riot Games. I have always been rooting for Legends of Runeterra, and played frequently up until I had started this channel about the Vanguard Overdress card game. I supported the game financially where I could, buying battle passes, boards, and even the lore and art book. These solutions were okay, and have largely worked for monetizing Riot's main game League of Legends up until very recently. But these solutions clearly haven't worked for Runeterra. Finding the numbers for this game is difficult, since Riot is embarrassed and doesn't often publish them. But from what we know, Runeterra has consistently been the worst performing game from Riot, making only about half of Teamfight Tactics revenue, and only about a fourth of Wild Rift's revenue in 2021, which was likely the best year for Runeterra. So, when the only news I'd receive about the game was implementing a rotation, then later scrapping PvP entirely, and finally releasing a new physical card game using the same assets of Runeterra, I was extremely sad that the team behind the game couldn't pull their act together and prove that a free-to-play friendly model could be successful. And that brings us to a larger problem of the card game market. Just how predatory does monetization have to be in order to ensure a game's success, if at all? Multiple different card games all have different approaches on how to make money from their players. Our Runeterra example falls very firmly on the free-to-play side of the wall. Anyone can start playing and can even build most decks very quickly. Monetization comes mostly from cosmetics and only a rare purchase of cards themselves. On the other extreme, we have games like Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh!, which are extremely predatory with their type of monetization. Players are required to spend thousands on either pulling packs or buying singles to even start playing the game. Add on top of that a constantly changing card pool and meta, and it'll bankrupt all but the most rich players. In the middle ground, we have games like the One Piece card game. Things cost money, and boxes can cost quite a bit of money, but the player return on investment is much higher, and the entry cost on singles is much lower than our extreme end. All of these examples make some use of gambling mechanics and how cards are obtained, but some games give you very little, and some are very generous. It's also a question of how much the game is a profit machine for the company, versus how much a card game is meant to be a game. Think Breath of the Wild versus Genshin Impact. Both can be good games, but they're very different in intention. If we break down a list of recently active card games on the market into categorizations of how predatory their monetization is, we get a spread of something like this. Do note the inclusion of a fourth category, since free-to-play can never be achieved by a physical card game, because physical cards will always take a large pool of resources to create and distribute, as well as being tied to a secondary market for value, which increases the use of direct gambling in these game systems. If you see your favorite game in the predatory section of this list, please chill, and I'll explain how I got to that distinction. For the largest deciding factor, it's a question of pool rates and box prices. There's two major models when it comes to card rarities. There's the Mythic model and the Rare model. The Rare model is the baseline for card games, pioneered for Magic the Gathering right at the start. There's your standard pool of common, uncommon, rare, and sometimes slightly higher rarity cards. This slightly higher rarity of cards can be pulled in a pack usually at about the rate of every 1 to 4 packs. This rarer pool typically only has about 8 to 15 options per set. It is worth mentioning the very beginning of Magic didn't even have a rarity on top of rare, which you could consider a separate, classic rare model. The Mythic Rare system introduces a new, more scarce rarity on top of the base ultra rare. These cards have a lower pull rate of about 1 in every 8 to 12 packs. Putting this into the perspective of real money, you'll know which cards these are by having the average cost to pull one be about $30 to $60. The pool for these cards are typically the same size or slightly smaller than the lower rare pool. This model is created to massively inflate the amount of product needed to complete playable sets of cards. Expect an average buy-in of about $600 from a set, versus a lower $200 to $300 from the regular rare model. If we combine this with the basic box and case prices for each card game, we can get a very good grasp on how much money a company wants players to spend on product. Which is why you could almost always reverse engineer the cost of a case from single prices and pull rates. And for those of you doubting, yeah, the average profit on a case opening is usually very thin, or sometimes even negative. Outside of pull rates, there are some other factors worth considering, like are there good supplementary products outside of boxes? Are there viable starter decks? How are reprints handled? And are there mechanically unique promo cards? Depending on how they're handled, these can go a long way to letting new players in more easily, or further rinsing their player base for yet even more money. There's also a question of how products are released, like are there oddly timed limited events, or artificial scarcity? These are gigantic red flags. Some more nuanced factors are direct-to-consumer sales or the number of products released. These tend to depend more on how they're implemented. Lastly, and most variably, is what's the average deck cost buy-in. I'll give a lot of games wiggle room here, because smaller games will be more all over the place due to the smaller secondary market. But it does factor in on my decision making for the more mixed bag games. And do understand that in a lot of cases, it's not going to be a hard distinction. Games like Lorcana have a half model between the Mythic and Rare system, although in Lorcana's case it does trend slightly to the Mythic system side. What really did it in for my Predatory categorization was the high buy-in price. Of course, while Lorcana is Predatory, I'd say it's nowhere near as bad as Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic, which have had 25 plus years to refine their tactics and build a consistent base. I find it super interesting that most Western games tend to go the Predatory route, while most Japanese games tend to go the more balanced or free-to-play route, at least when it comes to physical card games. It's a reflection of each of these regions' markets and general culture. Western players are much more driven to see their game as an investment, which affects what a company can get away with. While Eastern games do also want to be predatory, they're limited by much tighter competition. Now that we have this, we can get a good feel on how successful or unsuccessful these games are by category. And immediately, this is where we start to get complicated because every game's definition of success is scuffed. Each company behind each game is going to be looking for massively different things. One way we can start to figure out success is by looking at the size of a game's target audience to help determine how predatory they need to be. Some games, like Flesh and Blood, will have a significantly smaller audience than the biggest hitters, but by being more predatory, they'll cope naturally with smaller sales and fewer local events. The company's return on investment is higher, so it's very resilient, which, by the way, is an estimated revenue of $50 million, thus justifying, in air quotes, a very aggressive pricing structure. Of course, by this logic, larger games could be less predatory with their monetization. And this is true for some examples like Pokemon and One Piece, where large collectors markets, whales, and supplementary product sales allow the game to give more from buying product and for the minimum buy-in price to be a lot lower. But this doesn't explain games like Magic the Gathering, which have the second largest sales base in the West and maybe the largest active player base, yet is by far the most predatory company on this list. It goes beyond greed, and oftentimes against the will of the creators itself. Let's take a step back and look at card games more generally. For a game to be successful on its most basic level, you just have to get more revenue than expenses. This means selling enough product at a decent margin to make back your investment on artists, designers, printing, and distribution. To get enough sales, you need to market the game on some level, adding the cost. Some games are third-party IP based and will have to spend additional money on licensing that IP, but that helps make up marketing on some level. Art can be saved on through things like screenshots, not commissioning alt arts, or heaven forbid, through AI. Game designers can be saved on by limiting team size, playtesting groups, or time to design. Printing can be saved by getting cheaper cardboard, worse boxes, and contracting cheaper printing companies. Manipulating the supply side factors is interesting and important, but manipulating demand to generate sales is the more important factor in this case because it's where the majority of complaints come from, at least for predatory practices. we need to look at why players are attracted to playing a game or opening packs in the first place. First off, is just people who like to collect. High rarity versions, alternative arts, favorite characters, etc. Creating special styles at hard to get pull rates, or just theming around a certain gimmick or series, it's just not gonna be problematic on its own. In fact, I'd advise most card games to implement such practices, since they keep up with people who can or want to buy into card games at a level they're comfortable with. The issues really aren't with collectability, it's the other reasons for opening a pack: paying to compete, opening to gamble on the secondary market, or gambling because of addiction. The two biggest markets for card games come from whales and casual sales. Whales are players who'd spend hundreds to thousands of dollars on each new set, either to play, collect cards, or just to get the feeling of opening packs. Casual sales come from people just opening a few packs for fun, or to play locally with friends outside of tournaments. In the case of Pokemon, this would mean a child having their parents buying a pack for them at the supermarket, or in the case of Magic, it would be a dude buying a casual pre-con and a few packs to play with friends. There is a much smaller third market for budget players. It's a weird middle ground for people who are sizably invested in the game, but will just never spend large amounts of money on a product. This can include new players trying out competitive, or it can be the poorer or more price-conscious player. Out of these three, the relationship between card game companies and whales is the most likely to become problematic quickly, since it's inherently taking advantage of the type of player who would buy the product anyway. But then again, a lot of companies do depend on whales for the majority of sales. Using mobile games as an example distribution, about 60% of the average revenue will come from 20% of spending players, those who would spend thousands of dollars each year, and the other 40% of revenue comes from light spenders. So it's very obvious as to why game companies would target their most profitable demographic. It's worth mentioning that physical card games likely have a different but still similar split to the whales versus casual dynamic. Games like Pokemon, which are casual based, would have a higher portion of sales to the casual market. Not that the Pokemon scalper community isn't trying. Balancing this whale casual budget split is important to having a successful and stable card game. Whales need to be appealed to for profits, casual spenders need to exist for whales to prey on, and for the other massive chunk of your sales, and even budget players ought to be appealed to, as they are usually where most new players sit on the spectrum. But preying on the whales is what these games tend to do. Oftentimes, this will mean designing sets to need a larger amount of boxes to get chase cards, such as with the mythic versus rare system mentioned earlier. Oftentimes, companies will set collectors' rarities to be around one per box, or even one per case for a hit, such as with Union Arena doing a once per case pull rate on Foil Dawn. Physical cards do tie into a secondary market value, and opening physical and digital cards is very analogous to gambling. While I'd argue they're not as bad as loot boxes or anywhere near as bad as traditional machine gambling. But what if we made these chase cards competitive staples instead of just collector's items, forcing the portion of our community that is competitively minded into becoming whales, or at least enabling whale behavior? This is something every card game actively does to different degrees. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, it means a $600 to $800 case is going to be needed to be opened per competitive player in order to get those staples. It's a similar case for secret rares in One Piece and mythics in Magic. We could take this aggressive monetization further and ramp up prices on boxes to absurd degrees, or take some lessons from free-to-play mobile games and feature limited time sales windows, which some card games have implemented or have pseudo-implemented with scarcity. Tactics designed to prey on fear of missing out are a classic tactic salesmen use to get more money from players. Luckily, most card games don't actually need to be this predatory to stay afloat, and certainly can't be if they want to keep players long term. Trading cards first attracted investors because of how much money could be gained from consumers needing to pull specific cards. But the reason Magic the Gathering first attracted players is how rewarding the depth of skill interactions could be. It's the trading card versus card game aspects of a trading card game. I'd propose that a pay-to-win system inherently removes this depth and turns away even your most desperate for validation players. More so, it partially kills the appeal to the dedicated competitive player. The game's inherent need for fun is a pushback on how predatory a game is allowed to be. Even a significant barrier on pay-to-play hard locks out casual sales. Sometimes casuals will feel like they can't even approach the game. It's a massive wall contributing to the terrible new player onboarding experience for games like Yu-Gi-Oh! We are so incredibly lucky that the pitch of these card games in the West and Japan is the skill and fun interaction between players, because it's not the case in every market. The Chinese game market is brutal for being pro-pay-to-win and absurdly predatory, which has led to interesting issues with how card games have been spread in the country. Here's an interesting way to explain the difference. For most mobile games in the West, the maximum amount of money you could spend on a game and get returns for each block is going to be around $10,000 to $50,000, which is a lot, but in China, you could easily go over $100,000 with no real limit. There's an excellent talk from an old GDC where a developer admits to how he's personally taken advantage of the Chinese game market to make millions hunting whales. It's a bit gut-wrenching, but it's an excellent talk on the subject. And this brings us to a secondary factor of how predatory a card game needs to be in order to survive. How brutal is the market it's in? And there's three main markets we're going to want to focus on: the Japanese market, the Western market, and the free-to-play online market. The Japanese market is high competition, loves flashy and gimmicky effects, and has a solid big three card games, but also has a well-developed list of secondary games that are successful and are constantly being added and dropped. Players are closer together generally, so niche games can more consistently get players. It's led to every card game needing to be much more competitive. Card games still want to make money off their whales, but they also have to balance that with maintaining their casual and budget options, because there's a serious risk of losing players to the better deal. The Western market, by comparison, is much more spread out. It's more competitive focused, and based largely around the big three card games. Secondary games tend to be much more regional and can either be massive or non-existent, going from city to city. There's also a culture of reselling and scalping that's much stronger in Western markets, leading to things like new Pokemon sets leading to fights, or buyouts in every card game. Players are more ready to be taken advantage of and take advantage of others. Combine this with a lot of private equity in Western card game companies, and you have an unholy storm of predatory practices. More on that later. To further highlight the differences between the Eastern and Western market, I want to tell you the story of a card game that couldn't bridge the gaps between what these markets wanted. Force of Will was started as a solution to Magic the Gathering catered to the Japanese market. This meant a few things. First, cheaper and more accessible cards. Second, more explosive and splashy card design. And third, casual-only products. After some missteps, in 2015 the game exploded in popularity in the West as a competitive game, briefly rivaling even Magic the Gathering in sales. Now, the devs had no clue or even communication as to why their game was so successful in the West. And that's because they had accidentally created one of the best competitive formats ever, while not at all designing around it. I know that sounds insane, but it's true. For one single block of sets, a company managed to make a game that was not overly predatory, competitively fun and balanced, and financially successful. Of course, what came next isn't a big surprise. Following three of the biggest set releases, Force of Will would release a series of disaster sets and products that destroyed the game's reputation, competitive viability, and caused local stores and distributors to lose massive amounts of money. I'll highlight three products. First, Millennia of Ages. It was a set designed to be small, very casual or low power, and easily collectible. So much so that one box got you practically everything in the set. Millennia of Ages sold so poorly, it was famously rumored to have bankrupted stores. In fact, I recently bought some of this set from my locals because they still had it. The next set, Vengolf 2, was a crossover set designed first as a casual product. As such, there were very few competitive cards in the box to ensure competitive players wouldn't buy out the product. This was so casual players could always see the set in stores. Yeah, this is the actual reason given by the designers. Force of Will would be so engrossed in the casual experience, they forgot they had to sell products in the first place. Lastly, we'll talk about the next block of sets, Alice Cluster. that flashy first design would catch up with them. Zero-cost equipment, toxic anti-meta rulers, and a game-killing Tier 0 format. It would cause the game's player base to mostly leave, throwing the game into a collapse it never quite recovered from. Casual first game design in a physical card game was likely never going to succeed financially in the West. The established competition, and therefore established player base, is extremely competitive even to this day. Force of Will tried expanding into a wider casual player base that didn't really exist, only getting lucky to get off the ground initially. Along the way, they forgot to make products that would actually sell to a Western player base, and to make a meta that actually appealed to competitive players, and even players in general. It didn't matter that the game was cheap, easy to pick up, and had a ton of casual options, since no one wanted to play them. This trend of bad decisions would continue, driving away competitive players until much, much later in the game's history, when it could stabilize after a corporate takeover and power creeping to the moon. But I want to theorize that because the game was so accessible, I believe that the money needed to better stay on top of the market ran out sooner. Later on, they had to massively cheap out on art and drop several high-profile projects. They just dropped the act of juggling the budget, casual, and whale audience, because Force of Will only appealed to the casual and budget markets, which led to explosive growth, but a much more difficult time long-term. While not nearly as problematic mechanically as Force of Will, games like Flesh and Blood will be much more resilient on the Western market because they're so predatory. And that's the unfortunate thing. The padding on bad decisions a game gets to make is determined by how predatory its practices are. Let's take an example that's the exact opposite of Force of Will, MetaZoo. MetaZoo was a Kickstarter TCG released in 2020. It was remarkably successful, seeing an initial funding of $18,000 that would eventually steamroll into a massive wave of future sales, and a later Kickstarter of a secondary product hitting $1 million in funding in a day, likely just for some secondary limited quantity promos offered alongside it. MetaZoo's popularity came mostly from its success on the secondary market, due to some vendors buying the small initial wave of products and seeing massive successes. It led to larger vendors buying the next few waves of products and artificially creating a very strong market. Investors picked up the game en masse, and even tons of big retailers started to stock it as well. But each set would expand the print run, and resales wouldn't ever really come for the investors. Unfortunately, no one was actually playing the game, and very few players were actually buying it. Bluntly put, MetaZoo as a game was almost non-functional. Mechanics were janky at best and unplayable at worst. There existed cards that would change effects based on what color shirt you were wearing, and based on what the weather was outside. As a judge for card games myself, this feels like a rulings disaster. Like, this is a card that would be amazing in a joke format, but unfortunately, this is a serious design for a card game. Not to mention, the pull rates of the sets aren't good. You can open a case of product and not even get one of everything in a set, much less than needed 3 of for a playset. I'm talking about absurdly predatory pull rates, which I think helps explain why the market could reach such a high value, because there was never any major supply. Initially, collectors were appealed to with the quality of sealed product, and being so closely mocked up to Pokemon, both in the art and product design. But this game couldn't appeal to the casual market by being only an investment vehicle. It didn't help that the game's first successes rushed the creators into making a serious run of predatory practices. Limited time products, a lot of hard to obtain promos, a further decline in quality of the card game, and even flirting around with NFTs, plus never fixing the initial issues. It led to a decline in sales set after set with no real customer base, eventually going bankrupt 4 years later and needing a separate buyer to pull it back out. But that 4 years was a much longer run than most card games on the market. Especially given the card game's peak success, going from a small Kickstarter game to even showing up in big retail stores. By being so predatory, it created revenue to give the game an absurd run. But by targeting only those 20% of whales, the game completely failed to capture a core of casual players. Or, the players that would actually be needed for long-term success. MetaZoo failed because it only targeted whales. Force the Will failed because it only targeted casual spenders. In order to create a successful card game, you need to reach that golden mean. Unfortunately, predatory practices are kind of needed to help card games survive the short-term volatility of the card game market. Definitely not to the extent of games like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or MTG, because this risks losing a casual and budget market, leading to a vulnerability to competition and a stagnation of the customer base. We see this with Yu-Gi-Oh! Beginning to fall behind the One Piece card game, and we see this with Magic the Gathering having to take extreme actions to shift the game towards new players while bleeding their established customers. And that golden mean is extremely hard to chase. Even the closest games to it, like One Piece, have problems. Like, for the love of God, every card game needs to stop releasing mini sets as full-price boxes in the West. It has literally never worked for any card game, and it just creates problems down the line. Sorry, it is a tangent, but it's a good explanation of the larger difficulties of hitting that golden mean. Smaller sets are inherently easier to get playsets of, and raising box prices fills the need of making enough money to justify the product. It seems correct on paper, but it's actually a bad compromise. The average player is disincentivized from pulling multiple boxes due to the high buy-in and the low number of staples you'd actually need. And the collector is unhappy because the pull rates on chase cards are often artificially worse than bigger sets. You can't win. No amount of predatory monetization can save bad product design. So yeah, to summarize, a successful game needs to target both casual spending players and whale players to hit a magical middle ground of making everyone happy. All while not fumbling on other issues like core game balance, product design, and just fun generally. It really is no wonder why most card games fail after a while. I haven't yet described the third market for card games. Outside of the Western and Eastern market, there's a third option, the online market. Outside of the needs of physical cards and in-person play, the online market can avoid a lot of the traditional issues. Regional distances don't matter, the scalping culture is gone, there's usually not a secondary market, and free-to-play is actually an option. Yet, while all this is true, online card games tend to be the most predatory out of any card games. Online card games take directly from mobile game design, catering to whales first and enabling their behavior in a much more acceptable and easier manner. Limited time sales and events are common to drive FOMO. New spender discounts are very common. Most digital card games make you first convert your real currency into a fake in-game currency to disassociate the value of money from what you're buying. Online card games have the best control of the odds and can do a lot more to manipulate the odds than in physical card games. This further plays into the speed at which people can spend money and the ease of chasing losses being much faster on a mobile game. Plenty of games have a pity system to encourage more spending after losses. These mobile games are designed to build habits into their players and encourage daily and weekly use. Daily quests, login bonuses, limited time events, and battle passes play into this, really building an expected schedule of activities for a player to do. These games profit by getting you to maximize time on the device, which increases lifetime revenue. These are the exact same tactics as the actual gambling industry, but instead of having to progress an addiction from gambling to win to gambling to play longer, mobile games start with the customer being here to gamble to play. Of course, not every game is actually this severe in practice. The biggest card games like Magic Arena, Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, and Hearthstone all have some pretty clear limits to this, even if they still have very noticeable cutoffs on the new player or the free-to-play experience, and have gotten noticeably worse over time. But to summarize, mobile card games have the relationship between the player and the company much more skewed to the company. As such, the ease of implementing predatory practices is much greater. This is mixed in with a market already conditioned to expect predatory practices to an extreme degree. It leads to the most predatory market on average in the West and East. Let's go back to our Runeterra example, which couldn't compete with this. Not with other card games, and especially not with Riot Games' other cash cows. By generously giving away so many cards and awards, having very hard caps on purchases a player could make, and having PvE models being free to play for most of its lifetime, it left Runeterra struggling to get money. I mean, the $16 million it made is a lot of revenue, but not for Riot Games. I'd consider it a success. The development costs were likely high, but I'd wager it made its money back. Unless Riot Games were throwing away or embezzling money, which has happened before in the industry. But what I want to get more at is that Runeterra was a base to build future revenue from. If it had received more focus long-term and fleshed out its weaker features faster, it could have been a base for Riot Games. Unfortunately, due to the nature of private equity that is behind these major brands and therefore card games, short-term success is often prioritized beyond long-term stability and growth. This is doubled down on by market cultures, such as the Chinese absurd focus on short-term investments, or the Western focus on shareholder value. It leads to many games forced to become more predatory without actually having the need to, or face getting scrapped. Now, unfortunately, I feel the need to have to explain what private equity is. Private equity in this case refers to investment firms which buy massive amounts of stock in companies in order to achieve a profit. This is done by buying stable, but ultimately undervalued or lacking companies, then making changes and selling them later on once they're more successful. They also typically make a management fee and a performance fee, which add a massive incentive for spiking profit. The type of changes these companies make is what's going to concern us here. Of course, these investment firms don't have a personal relationship with the company, product, or consumer, so it leaves anything on the table, shady or not. Looking at one of the biggest examples, Magic the Gathering, Hasbro, who owns Wizards of the Coast, who own Magic, have about 80% of their company's stock owned by institutional investors. This includes big companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. And I'd hazard a guess that this is a massive factor contributing to why Wizards of the Coast is so bonkers for making dumb short-term profit decisions. It's for shareholder value immediately. Hasbro in 2019 had the bright idea to tell Wizards of the Coast to double its revenue over the span of 5 years. This was entirely to appeal to its shareholders. And doubling profits is hard to do long-term, but doing it in the short term is often straight up self-destructive. Wizards of the Coast would increase premium product releases, quadruple the amount of products released, power creep the shit out of every format, then implement massive bans, start directly selling card sets to the consumer through secret layers, some of which were mechanically unique, axe or shrink most lore stories or books, almost never reprint any chase cards at a lower rarity, dilute the IP with gimmick sets, fully introduce crossover sets and incorporate them into every format, release $1,000 proxies for their anniversary product, almost kill their competitive scene, start using AI art, and scrap printed demand for direct-to-consumer products to drive artificial scarcity. There are a lot more, but I think you get the point. Companies with shareholder-driven goals will make irrational decisions for greater profit in order to drive up shareholder value. Since shareholders can always sell and just move to another company, the long-term stability or basic integrity is a non-factor. Decisions start getting made that make more money immediately at the expense of goodwill, trust, and quality. And it really is insidious just how predatory even the subtle changes are. For example, when MTG introduced set boosters and had them compete with and eventually somewhat replace draft boosters, this new style of set did two major things. First, it increased the number of potential minor hits from a pack, and second, it served to further obscure the odds of pulling chase cards by constantly rotating what these extra slots could be in each set. This let Wizards of the Coast market the sets as being better for opening, despite an increased intended MSRP offsetting any real gains, while changing the pack opening experience to be more focused on constant minor hits, which is shockingly close to the progression of machine gambling in the US. All this should be fine, but these set boosters do come at a gameplay cost. They inherently don't work as well in draft formats, which are designed around a tight card pool and limited access to rare and mythic cards. Examples like this are littered throughout the game. Look, Magic will keep printing money, but it's less and less Magic every year. There's more sets that aren't for you every year, and more angry and upset players that badmouth the game every year. It's a shame, because Magic the Gathering is an amazing game. Some of the most depth ever in the industry. All this to say that games with shareholders need to make more profit than games independently owned. It helps to consider games like Magic the Gathering as a nameless product first and as a game second. Because, rest assured, the people making the highest level decisions already do. It's a similar story with companies like Activision Blizzard, Sony, and Disney. If we bring this back to our original question of how predatory a game needs to be to survive, for games like Magic the Gathering, the answer to shareholders is the game can never be predatory enough. Whatever they think will get them more money will be implemented, but it won't ever be enough. Which is a problem because the long-term answer to survival is a lot more nuanced. You can't go overboard. It bleeds players long-term and slowly kills sales. Your revenue might go up continuously, but the risk only gets higher and the profit margins will often get lower. Eventually you will hit critical mass and open yourself up to competition or failure outright. It's why so many gigantic companies are struggling today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. On a personal note, I'm getting my master's degree in project management. It's unfortunate because I've never come to despise anything more in my life. I've read countless textbooks, all in support of similar predatory tactics for how to run things and drive people for results they might not actually want. And it's so miserable because it doesn't actually work. It's built on outdated systems that don't understand that people are human. Or maybe they do, and that's worse. But our current systems of management enable bloat, personal politics, and corruption while hampering actual work and especially the process of creation. Anyway, I did say that my last video was so positive because this one is so negative. I was right. Please subscribe for more, I guess.